would like to introduce Robyn O'Brien, who has been called Food's Erin Brockovich by Bloomberg and the New York Times. We're going to be talking about the way food affects those not only with food allergies, but those on the autism spectrum. Welcome, Robyn. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for doing this.
So, you have a background in finance, and you're kind of an unlikely person to be speaking out on children's health. Can you share how you got started?
Yeah, absolutely. I was raised in a really conservative Texas family. I went to business school on a full scholarship, and I was recruited by different industries like the oil and gas industry and companies like Exxon and Enron. But I get bored really easily. I know that about myself, and so I went to work as an equity analyst on a team that managed $20 billion in assets. And, at the time I was the only woman on the team, so the guys had me cover the food industry. And I didn't know how to cook. I burnt noodles. I was not a foodie. I was your typical, kind of 20-something where I was drinking the diet sodas and, trying to navigate health through kind of a fat-free way. It's how I'd been raised. And I really didn't think twice about it. And when we decided to start our family, I thought, I'm going to step down from the finance world for a few years, fully intending to go back into it. And so we had these 4 children really close together really quickly. And even then, as a busy mom, I really was not particularly sensitive to it. I figured whatever was on grocery store shelves was fine and safe, and was shopping at Costco. I didn't think twice. And then our 4th child had an allergic reaction one morning over breakfast. And that morning, it was Lego my Eggo waffles and tubes of blue yogurt and scrambled eggs. And I didn't even recognize it as an allergic reaction at first. And she just got fussy, and I went to put her down for a nap. And for some reason, I don't know why, to this day, I went up and checked on her a few minutes later, and her face was full and shut. And I thought, I had no idea what has happened here. And I turned to the older 3 and I said, did you guys put something in her face? And they gave me just these blank little kid stares, and I just at that moment got terrified because I thought, what is happening to the health of my child? And we raced to the pediatrician's office, and she said, these are allergic reactions, and she starts kind of rattling off that data. And in my head, I'm thinking, this data didn't exist when we were kids. Why are so many children impacted by food allergies? How in the world am I going to protect the health of my child? It was just a moment of just complete terror. And I got back home, and, as we got everything under control, that afternoon, when all 4 kids were down for a nap, I just wanted to see the data. I didn't want anything emotionally charged around this, and I figured the data would tell their own story. And so as I sat down that afternoon, it was in January of 2006, when you go in to dig for data on children with food allergies, you don't just get food allergies. And so as I started looking for data on the health of the American children, an entire story started to unfold. And as I was looking, I was realizing, this was back in 2006, the numbers of children with food allergies was 1 in 17. Today, that number's 1 in 13. Back in 2006, the numbers of children with autism was 1 in 110. Today, that number's anywhere between 1 in 68 and 1 in 45, and then the rates of asthma, 1 in 10 kids. And I was looking at the rates of diabetes and how kids born in the year 2000, which is my daughter's 10th grade class, 1 in 3 of those kids are expected to be insulin dependent by the time they reach adulthood, and 1 in 2 minorities, and you start looking at all this data together, and I just thought, oh my gosh, what is happening to the health of our children? This is the future of our country. And nobody was talking about it in its entirety. And I thought that, I think part of me at that point kept hoping that I would find some data or some information that somehow would tell a different story. And so I kept looking. And so I turned to things like the CIA, where they list life expectancy at birth. And I thought, the United States, we've got to be kind of in the top 10 or the top 20, and I start scrolling through this list on the CIA's website, and we hover around 50, and again, it was just this mind-blowing data about this collective health of our children. And so as I was looking at all of this, I just kept thinking, what is a child with a food allergy? What's even happening here? And I was seeing this overlap between children with food allergies and children with asthma, or children with food allergies and children with autism. And I kept thinking, why is there this overlap? And a child with food allergies, when they have an allergic reaction, their body is responding to food as if it's foreign. And so they launch this foreign, this attack to drive out this foreign invader. And, I began to think about it. I thought, this is something different in our food. is there something foreign in our food that wasn't there that's triggering these children's bodies to respond this way? And so, I'd been a financial analyst, and I had this system of capturing data every morning that I had used when I had sat on the equity desk. And so I decided I would just execute that same system and learn everything that I could about food allergies. And so I set up Google Alerts for absolutely everything. I set up Google Alerts for allergy, autism, ADHD, and asthma. I set up Google Alerts for, food allergies, and all these different ways that I could try to harness data as I was trying to come up to speed on this. And, it was somebody who had covered the food industry, but no one talked about the impact on kids. It was just, hey, we're going to take this real ingredient out. We're going to replace it with this artificial ingredient, and that's going to drive our margins. That's going to drive profitability. And that was kind of my attachment. That was the extent. And so as I was capturing this data, I can remember one morning in October 2006, a headline came through my screen, and it was a small study, a grant that had been given by the EPA to a small university in Michigan. And the title of the study was, Do Genetically Engineered Foods Cause Food Allergies? And I thought, well, what's a genetically engineered food? And so as I started looking at, what is this genetically engineered food, and realizing they'd been introduced in 1996, the first patents had been filed in the late 1980s, that these things literally had only been in our food supply for about 20 years. And no one was talking about them, And I thought, this is crazy. And how have these things been introduced without anybody talking about them? And as I began to reach out to different people, literally nobody knew what I was talking about. Nobody 10 years ago was talking about GMOs. And people looked at you like you had three heads. And, again, I was just like, this is just mind-blowing that we have completely changed the way that we grow food in this country. We've genetically engineered corn. We've genetically engineered soy so that we can spray more of this weed killer Roundup, which we're all told not to keep under our kitchen sinks. We've genetically engineered our food to tolerate more of this stuff. And nobody was told. Parents weren't told. And at that point, I just went into this very dark place thinking, how much of this soy did I eat during my pregnancies? How much of this have I fed to my toddlers? Thinking it was healthy, not knowing it had been genetically engineered to withstand all this weed killer. And it was like Alice down the rabbit hole. It just kept going and going and going, and the further that I looked, there was cross-reactivity studies. There were all kinds of studies. There was, the introduction of the artificial growth hormone, RBGH, which was in 1994. And again, I thought, so are we allergic to milk, or are we allergic to what's been done to it? And no one could answer that question. And at that point, in the early years of the work, it was incredibly isolating. I was sort of unearthing the story that I didn't really want to tell. My own family, my own really conservative family, really struggled with it a little bit, kind of thinking, just don't go there. That was kind of their advice, don't go there. But the more that I looked, the more I realized that here in the United States, we had allowed all these new things. We had allowed all these foreign proteins, all these artificial ingredients, where other countries around the world had said no. And especially when it came to the health of their children, they had emphatically said no. They had basically said, we're going to exercise caution. And here in the U.S., it had just been the exact opposite. These things had just been introduced and introduced and introduced. And so, I kind of stepped back and I thought, what are all these things doing in combination? And as I started asking those questions, I still was just, it was such an innocent curiosity as I began the work. And I still, to this day, could never have anticipated what it would become.
Wow. And I think that, moms out there, we're all out there just trying to help our babies. And, how lucky for you that you had the persistence and the determination to continue to research. I love that you said you put all those Google alerts on, because I know myself and many other moms have done that. And so it was kind of nice hearing that there's not just a few of us, there's a whole bunch of us out there doing that. I don't know.
Well, and I think, it's so important, I think, and I've seen it over the decade of work that I've been doing. This generation of parents is remarkable. And we are very well educated. We've had amazing careers, whether it's a mom that's been an attorney or an accountant who's done some creative design. There is amazing intellect in this generation. We've had the opportunity of education unlike any generation before us. And that intuition and that gut that that is so persistent, that has you asking these questions, why, you cannot dismiss that. And I think, what I found is how important it is that not only do we ask those questions, but that we do it in a way where we support ourselves with data, that we can say, these epidemics don't just fall out of the sky. Genetics do not change this quickly. Genetics do not change this quickly for food allergies or autism. Genetics do not change this quickly. So what has changed? And, I realized early on that I could execute anything financially looking at the model. What I didn't have was the science. And so I began to reach out to scientists very early on. And as I did, it was fascinating because there were a couple of organizations that just freaked out and had a complete allergic reaction to me. And then there were others that were like, oh my gosh, we had no idea either. Or I've been repeatedly dismissed. Or, a scientist said he tried to reach out to different organizations and he'd been dismissed. And so, again, I had to step back and say, what is going on? And why in the food allergy space are we not talking about these new proteins? Because that seems like it should just, at the very least, be a precaution that parents could take to say, hey, GMOs were introduced in the late 1990s. Be aware as you navigate food allergies. But nobody was saying that, And so naively now, in hindsight, at the time, naively, I reached out to the world's largest, or the U.S.'s largest food allergy organizations. And I mean, truly the only way to describe what happened is they just had this complete allergic reaction to me. And they really pushed back, and really kind of tried to get me to be quiet and pipe down. And with a background in finance, I thought, that makes no sense. Why wouldn't you exercise precaution? We're not claiming anything one way or the other. We're just saying, hey, these are new. 64 countries labeled them. A lot of countries didn't allow them. And here in the U.S., we think it's important that parents know. And as I began to pull their financial statements, I realized at the time that they were funded by Kraft and that, some of their scientific board members were working with a company called Monsanto. And so then at that point, I'm thinking, are they trying to solve this? But why isn't this disclosed? And, what do we do with this information? And if parents knew this information, would it impact, their decision-making when it came to their kids? And so I took that to different scientists, and most of the scientists that I spoke with had no idea that food allergy research was being funded by these two companies and that this organization was funded by these two companies. And that's when I realized we need transparency. We need transparency not only around the way food is made, but we need transparency around how the science is funded. Because, as we've seen recently, when companies like Coca-Cola are funding obesity studies, we tend not to believe them. And so it's the same when there are studies in the food allergy or autism community. It's so important to know where that money is coming from and if there is a conflict of interest or any kind of reason to sway it one way or the other. And so as I really began to dig into the space and realize what was happening in the food allergy space, the way studies were being funded, again, I thought this is something parents have to know. And so I started this little website, Allergy Kids, and through that, began this communication. And something that I saw really quickly was how badly we needed each other, how, we were fighting to even get people to accept these diagnoses, whether they were autism or allergies or ADHD, to even recognize that they were very real and that this wasn't some fabrication and that we weren't slapping these labels on our kids for attention. And as I started to work into these communities, it was, no one in their right mind would ever choose to have a child with food allergies. No one would choose that autism diagnosis. But as we are dealt it, you realize you have to do the best you can with what you have. And that community I started to see was so powerful and so strong, and that, if people had come through the different emotions of the diagnosis, whether it was fear or sadness or anger or grief, that at the bottom of that, the reason that we felt all those emotions was because of love. And I realized that if you could tap into that love, it was a rocket fuel, and it could totally create changes that would be seemingly impossible. And that to me was, once I really hit onto the power of that positive love-fueled energy, I realized that we really could start to create extraordinary change.
Wow, I totally understand why they call you the Aaron Brockovich because you definitely went in there and digged and really figured out the formula of what was happening. Now, what is happening with the health of the American children beyond autism? I mean, you touched on a little bit of the statistics with diabetes and other things going on, but what's your view on that on an overall perspective?
Well, sadly, our generation of children has earned the title of Generation RX. And as a mother of four, as I was unearthing this data, it was terrifying. And, it's not just the rates of autism in the last decade that we've seen increase and increase and increase. It's food allergies, it's diabetes, it's obesity, it's all of these conditions. The President's Cancer Panel says that cancer is the leading cause of death by disease in American children, and it was not always this way. And there are a lot of different factors and there are a lot of different theories. But when you step back from our food system and say the rest of the world has exercised the level of precaution that we have not, given the health of our children, it is absolutely time that we execute, that level of precaution. And so whether you're talking about artificial food colors, which countries around the world have said don't put them in kids' products, or if you're talking about this artificial growth hormone that the United States is the only developed country in the world to allow. Why are we doing that? If we talk about GMOs and the fact that they are labeled for 60% of the world, but not here, again, why are all these things being put into our food and we're not even told about it? We're not even having the conversation and they're not even labeled. And how can we as parents do a better job of navigating around that? Again, like when you're looking at statistics on children's health, you get the whole picture. You realize that the President's Cancer Panel isn't just saying, hey, cancer is the leading cause of death by disease in kids. They're also saying, hey, 1 in 2 men are expected to get cancer in their lifetime and 1 in 3 women. And those numbers are just jaw-dropping, So again, it's like, what can we do now to protect the future of our country later? And I think food plays such a fundamental role in that. And there are obviously a lot of factors that need to be considered, but let's control the ones that we can. And so as I started looking at the food system, I think the thing that hit me the hardest was the fact that our American food companies formulate their products differently for families overseas. So, if there's Kraft or Coca-Cola or Walmart or any of those companies, they're making their products without GMOs or without artificial dyes or without artificial growth hormones for families overseas. And I thought, at the very least, they can bring those products home. We're not asking them to reinvent the wheel. And given the health of our families today, with all of these different conditions and the fact that all of them together have now given our children this title of Generation RX, what can we be doing? And again, it was the conservative side of me was always looking for sort of conservative benchmarks and conservative data. And quite honestly, something that I knew if I sat down at the dinner table with my dad, I could argue it, that he could not dismiss it as something that was, on the fringe or somehow insignificant. And so I always tended, towards the data, towards these very conservative sources, because I thought, this has got to be an irrefutable talking point. And really, it was when I hit on that double standard that I really thought, that's the talking point. The fact that our companies are already doing this for families overseas. It's time for them to do it here.
Absolutely. And you talked about, the different changes in our food with the growth hormones and the artificial colors, and you mentioned even GMOs. Can you tell us about the introduction of GMOs and why other countries label them and we don't?
So, it's interesting, and as a business model, it makes sense. I think about if I were still covering the industry, as a business model, it makes sense. What's fascinating is that I did cover the food industry, and we did not cover GMOs. The chemical industry analysts did. And what happened was that, the chemical companies that make all these weed killers and all these pesticides, that's kind of the lion's share of their revenue. And in the late 1980s, early 1990s, they introduced genetically engineered seeds that they had genetically engineered to withstand increasing doses of this weed killer Roundup. And we know Roundup. We're told not to keep it under the kitchen sink. They had genetically engineered crops like corn and soy to withstand more of it. And, the goal was to kind of help control weeds and make these seeds resistant so that they could be sprayed more often and not be damaged. And so those crops were called Roundup Ready corn, Roundup Ready soy. And then a second kind of GMO was introduced. And it was due to growing concern of the spraying of insecticides. And so scientists were able to introduce this GMO that was genetically engineered to produce its own insecticide internally within the plant. And, when I learned that was incredibly difficult as a mother because, we do know to wash the pesticides and insecticides off of our produce. We're taught that. But if it's been genetically engineered into the corn itself, we can't wash that off. And so countries around the world, as these two new products were introduced, said, we just don't know what the long-term impact is going to be. And so they labeled them. And in some cases, over 30 countries around the world banned them. They said, we're not sure what this would even do to our soil. So we don't want it planted in our soil. And so, as I learned that, again, I stepped back and I thought, why have we been so free, giving these guys such a hall pass when other countries have exercised this level of precaution? And, it was fascinating to really step back and realize, that there are industries that have enormous control. They have enormous representation inside these agencies and in our government. And quite honestly, that was a really discouraging time in this work for me because it felt really, really big. And I thought, can one person really make a difference? And as I was trying to figure out how to build a team around this, people kept saying, your food's Erin Brockovich, you should reach out to Erin Brockovich. And I didn't, again, think how does that work? You're a mom of 4 out in Colorado and you just pick up the phone and reach out to Erin Brockovich? How's that going to work? And I didn't know how it would work. So I went on her website and I kind of studied what she was about now because I only knew about her from the movie, and I studied about what she is now. And I just went totally type A on myself, and I spent probably 2 weeks crafting this 4-sentence email to Erin Brockovich. And I just thought I just have to send this. I don't know if she'll respond, but I have to at least try. And when she responded a few days later, it just blew me away. She said she had lost her brother to a food allergic reaction, and he had been 37 years old. And she said, I'm so glad someone's taking this on. So I had been kind of hoping she would take it on, and all of a sudden she was sort of throwing it back at me. And I thought, oh my gosh, I've got to take this on. But then I thought, what if one person really can make a difference? And so I began to build a team, and I reached out to different people who had been involved with Monsanto, on previous issues. Guys like Robert Kennedy Jr. had sued them for, pollution and contamination. I knew he had kids with allergies. So I began to reach out to different individuals. And it was fascinating because not very many people knew about GMOs 10 years ago. And when you talk about the business model by this chemical company, it's pretty darn smart. It helps them sell more chemicals. But I cannot, for the life of me, come up with a single good reason why they have not been labeled for Americans when our own companies are labeling them overseas. And as you look at countries like Brazil, where they, were labeled, it didn't increase food prices. You look at countries like China, Russia, India, UK, all across Europe, everybody's labeling these except for us. So the economies didn't fall apart. Farmers didn't fall apart. Food companies weren't run out of business. They just put the label on the product. So, that became a very important focus of mine because I felt that double standard was just intolerable given the health of our children. I saw families very close to me that were dealing with autism, and I could see the impact, and you can feel the impact. You feel it in every level of that family. You feel it in the marriage. You feel it with the siblings. You feel it everywhere. And there were so many families that are dealing with so many of these different conditions. And then again, when I turned to the cancer piece, I thought, how can we not be exercising precaution? And so I became a very kind of strong advocate for labeling and recognizing that the technology may one day yield all the things that these companies promise, but right now, they don't. And right now, given the health of our children, we need to know exactly how our food is made and exactly what is going on to it. And so as I kind of began to advocate, there was a lot of press around it, and the New York Times reached out and did this article. And with that article, all of a sudden, I found myself sort of in the middle of this national debate. And Random House and a couple of the publishing houses reached out, and they said, this is fascinating. Can you come to New York? And I came to New York to talk to them, and it was mostly mothers that were around those tables, and they we had these conversations about this double standard, and it just totally ticked them off. It didn't matter who they were. That double standard that we've done things in a very different way to the rest of the world, and that our own companies are doing this differently for us, was so universally offensive. And so in 2009, my book, The Unhealthy Truth, came out. And then, naively, I thought I was done. I thought, I've written this book. Everybody got it. I'm going to go back to what I had planned, which was still finance. And at that point, people said, no, you have a very powerful story and a very powerful way of talking about it, and you have to keep talking about it. And that first year, from 2009 through 2010, it was incredibly isolating. It was incredibly, intimidating, and it took me from sort of this introverted financial person to where I had to put myself out there for this movement and for these children. And so I did. And in 2011, I was asked if I would give a TEDx talk in Austin, and I really didn't want to do that. I had pretty much every reason in my head why I shouldn't do that. And I sent an email to a friend, and he said, yeah, you kind of got to do that. That's a big one. You got to do it. And I thought, I've never given a presentation at this point with PowerPoint slides behind me. It was not what I was looking to do.
And that was your first one? Was a TED Talk?
Yeah, it was my first one. And
wow, you start high.
I know. And I hadn't even seen a TED Talk. And so I Googled it, to see what they look like. And out popped this talk of Tony Robbins. And it basically was, we can get in our own way. And he kind of pointed at Al Gore. And we can sabotage what we're meant to be here for and what we're meant to do, and live a life of regret not doing it. And I just thought, I have to do this. And I watched his talk about 6 times and sat down and wrote mine. And it was a total life-changing experience, because at that point, the audience was about 600 people, and I hadn't had an audience that big. It was just me on that stage, and I just said a prayer right before I went on to let my heart speak. And it was a game changer. It went viral. It's been translated into all these different languages. It's been viewed, across all these different websites and shared across all these different things. And it was just me talking about this business model as a mother and as somebody who had this finance background. And as I continued to speak out about it, it was fascinating, because I started to hear from CEOs inside of these big companies, like the CEO of Nestle's frozen food division. He was dad of 3. And he never told me exactly what it was his kids had, but it was very personal to him. And he said, I need you to come out here because you can talk about things I can't, and you can say things that I can't. And really, it was in that moment where I realized we do play a very, very critical role as parents of this generation, and that courage is so contagious, and that we have to find that courage to speak out, and that we also have to trust that at this point, the numbers and the statistics and the data are so high that we do not stand alone. And as I began to speak out, I realized it was giving, especially these executives, the courage to speak out too. And that was just such transitional time in the work to realize that very quietly inside these companies, there were people that were hugely supportive of what was happening.
You are so inspirational. I mean, I'm just listening to you going, wow, it's what a neat story. I'm sure one day they'll make a movie about you, if it's not already in the works. And when you're talking about all this, I'm thinking, all these different conditions that are out there, like autism and allergies and ADHD and asthma, how in your point of view, how is that really impacting the American families?
It's impacting us on so many levels. There are studies that talk about how having a child with food allergies increases your cost per child per year by $4,200 just from the food allergies alone. And then you layer on top of that the healthcare costs, the added medical costs, for any of these conditions, whether it's treatment, for autism, whether it's treatment for allergies, whether it's treatment for diabetes, the time and the costs that are associated on that, the crush that puts on productivity, the way that it eats into any of our time that we may have with our spouse or with other children, with our families. And the United States spends more on healthcare and disease management than any other country on the planet. So Right now, 18 to 20 cents of every dollar we spend is spent managing disease and managing these conditions. And I can promise, if we were to go around and poll every American, there's no way people would say, hey, yeah, I want to give 20 cents of every dollar to that. There's so much more that we could be putting that towards. And it's hitting us on every level. So it's not only hitting us personally, at the family level, it's impacting businesses, it's impacting an employee's ability to show up, it's impacting the way a business has to manage their healthcare program, and ultimately it's impacting our economy. And I think, to me, one of the more really kind of moments that hit me between the eyes of just how critical this can be is my parents actually met in the Vietnam War. My dad was in the U.S. Army, so I was very much raised with such a complete and profound appreciation for the people that serve in our military. And as I was looking at a lot of this data recently, I thought, okay, these kids are not healthy as a collective. So how is this impacting our military? And 7 out of 10 young Americans do not qualify to serve in our military today because of the conditions that we are now seeing in our children and because of all the medications that are required to treat it. And I thought, this is national security. We've got to restore the health of our children. It's a national security issue, and I truly believe that with every cell in my body.
Absolutely. And when you talked a little bit about the military, how is that affecting or impacting the military with the different foods and the different things that are going on with them? Because I know, don't they have limited foods at different areas when they're traveling about, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. In different camps and different parts of the country, different parts of the world. It depends on access. And so, unfortunately, I have heard from so many military families that want better food and they can't. And so, they want to bring special products into the daycare center, at the camps, and they're not allowed to. They want access to, things like organic milk, but it's not supplied. And it's like they are limited by whatever is brought in, to the stores, into the different places where they're all working. And again, it's like, if we're going to protect the health of our country, we have to protect the health of our military. And so, access for these families to better food, to food that's free from all these artificial things, free from GMOs, they don't have that access right now. And a lot of them are starting to speak out on it. And it's like, it's like any kind of cafeteria system. I mean, you think about our school cafeterias and the kids only have what's provided. It's the same for the military and those families. And so I think, we really have the opportunity. You can either spend a lot of time stressing over what we've inherited, which is kind of a mess, or you can say, okay, there's huge opportunity to build a better system. There's huge opportunity to figure out a way to get better food to military families. Huge opportunity to really educate these companies that are putting the food in school cafeterias, to really think about the way we budget things at the national level and the priorities that we make. How can we better allocate financials to a lot of these different initiatives that truly 10 years from now are critical to protecting the health of our country. And I do think it's some pretty big stuff, and that can seem really intimidating on the one hand, and I definitely felt that in the early years of the work. But I think a better way to look at it is to say, look at all this opportunity. And none of us can do everything, but all of us can do something. So pick your thing. What thing is it that you're the most passionate about? Is it school food? Is it access? Is it supporting farmers? Is it legislation? Is it making sure that there are EpiPens on every plane flight? There's so many places where people can step in and be part of this movement and help create change.
Now, you mentioned lots of different things they can do to pick kind of like which group, but what can they do at home right now and in their communities or even with their local representatives?
So, I think it's the best place to start is at home. And when I was first learning all of this and learning about how junked up the food was, I mean, I'm embarrassed at how our kitchen was. And I have had people say since, like, you were so bad that I knew if you could do it, I could do it, and I really was that bad. Like, it was bad. And it was, I'd had 4 kids really fast. I didn't want to think about it. I didn't want to struggle. It was hard enough to get them fed, and I hadn't done a good job. And I do think, like, from where I was to where I am today, it speaks to how we really can do this, and you can let yourself do it in baby steps, and you can take on what you're ready to take on, when you're ready to take it on. You don't have to do everything all at once. And so, for us, I thought, I want the artificial dyes out because that's linked to hyperactivity. And, they don't use the dyes in M&Ms and Gatorades overseas, so let's get them out of them here. So we started to kind of phase out the artificial dyes. The artificial growth hormone, RBGH, that's in our dairy that no other developed country allows, that one really bothers me because I thought, we cannot be the only country in the developed world that has allowed this. That makes no sense. And thankfully, you can go into Kroger, Safeway, Harris Teeter, Piggly Wiggly, anywhere, and you can now find milk that's RBGH-free or organic, which by law is RBGH-free. So, those are kind of two baby step things that I could do, but I was so terrible about it that even in the beginning, I was sort of just looking at the stuff for my child with food allergies. And then I realized, the health of one of my boys had struggled so much. And as I started looking at him and reading different books by people like Dr. Kenneth Bach and Healing the New Childhood Epidemics, I realized that there was a lot I could be doing for all of the kids to help build better health in them. And so, we took these baby steps and then, getting GMOs out and really trying to steer around them. And it wasn't in this strident, rigid way. I was mindful of the fact that I have 2 girls and 2 boys, and I didn't want to create an eating disorder in a child. So I thought, I've got to have some grace and flexibility here. But I also, they need to understand. And so there was a real education. We're teaching them, this is why we're making these choices, and this is why it's important to me, and you're going to feel better if you eat better. That's just common sense, and this is why. And so we really tried to teach the kids from a very young age, how their choices impacted them. And now that I've got 2 in high school and 2 in middle school, it really worked. And, they will make a bad choice every once in a while, and they know how they're going to feel, and they're mindful of it, and they don't do that too often because nobody wants to feel bad. So, as they've learned to navigate their health, in a lot of ways it's become easier once we kind of got through those middle school years. Once they got to high school, it became a lot easier. But that's how we started at home. And then, people would suggest that I would reach out to a legislator, and that just seemed hugely intimidating for some reason. And yet, once I finally found the courage to do that, I realized that they're just like us, and that they've got these young staffers in their offices who are, in their 20s and 30s, super passionate about these issues, have siblings with autism or food allergies or any of these conditions. And it's very personal. And so you get these young staff members in these offices who can really, kind of spearhead a lot of these initiatives for you. And in a lot of cases, the legislators just don't know. And they'll tell you that if a mom or a dad takes the time to reach out, they know that issue is representative of a lot of their constituents. And that when one person reaches out, they realize that there are actually a lot of people behind them. And so, that was something that required me to be really braver than I thought I was to start to do that. I don't know why I was so intimidated. I just picture them behind some huge mahogany desk, totally intimidating. But then, you're greeted by all these 30-year-olds that were just awesome. So that's another way to get involved. And then, the other thing is, don't be afraid to host an event or a night at your school or at your church or somewhere in your community where, it's about, kids and food and, about, feeding kids or building healthy kids and you can, if you make it sort of broader than just food allergies or broader than just autism, you realize that there are so many families who really are struggling with this and so many families who want to learn. And my advice is when you do host an event like that, and the first one I did, it was tiny. 6 people came, but I invited my pediatrician because I thought I want somebody on hand who's got a medical background. He came, and then I invited another woman who was a registered dietitian. And I just thought, I just want them on hand to speak to any issues that may come up. And there were 6 people there that day. And probably the greatest sign I should have realized now was that pediatrician and that registered dietitian ended up getting married. And I thought, okay, that's good. That's good. That's a good awesome foundation for this. But, I do think, don't be afraid to start small, but do also make sure you invite a pediatrician or an allergist or somebody who can speak a little bit more to the science. because then you don't feel as vulnerable. So we did that, and we started hosting these events where parents could come together. And, unfortunately, the data is very real and the statistics are real. And these conditions are really impacting so many more people than you would realize. And even today, still, I'll share something and hear from a dad who says, "Thank you so much for doing this. My son has autism." Or, I'll post something and I'll hear from a friend from college who says, "Thank you so much for doing this. I just was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer." And so many of us are trying to protect the health of our families. And I think we come at it in so many different ways. The first door that I came through was food allergies. But as I opened it, I realized, oh my gosh, our children are dealing with so much. Our families are dealing with so much. And most people do. And I think for those that have the capacity to do something more than just, change the things in their house, the families will thank you so much for that. If you can organize something, a support group, something, you're so appreciated for that. And I think don't underestimate how those little things can add up, and don't underestimate how we can start to create these changes together. And I think the alliances that we're starting to see, the foundation that you're part of is such a great example of that, with food companies saying, of course we want to help these kids, of course we want to be part of it. That kind of partnership and that kind of energy is so powerful. And so, don't be afraid to ask. And that, again, is getting out of your comfort zone a little bit. But I've learned that, no is just a word. It's not a sentence. It's not something terminal. It's just a word, and it's just no. And if somebody says no, you just say, okay, that's just a no. Get to the next one, and we're going to keep going until we get to yes. And, because of the data and the way it stands today with the rate, 1 in 3 kids now have allergies, autism, ADHD, or asthma. Because of that, it does not take you long to get to that yes. And that, to me, is sort of this incredibly powerful collective energy.
That is very powerful. Now, I can't believe our hour is nearly up, but, what is one thing you would, tell those that are listening right now? Because we covered a lot. So what's one thing you want to tell them?
I definitely think the most important thing is to believe in your ability to create change. And that's going to look different to everybody, and it's going to look different at home, and it's going to look different in your community. But that courage is so contagious, and that if you speak out on these issues, it gives someone beside you the courage to do the same. And you cannot underestimate how powerful one voice can be in your community, in your school. You never know that when you have the courage to speak out, that you may be touching the life of another parent who needs you so much. And that it definitely is this dance. It's a give and take, and we all go through stages where sometimes you have that extra capacity, you have that ability to give, and sometimes you really need to be on the receiving end from somebody who is in a place where they can give. And I think to really recognize that to move through this, we have to do it together. But that really, to really find the courage to begin to speak out, because I think up until this point, it's been too easy to dismiss us as parents. And whether I'm speaking to a diabetes, group, or to a food allergy group, or, a group at MD Anderson that's working on the cancer issues, when you realize how powerful we are together, that's unstoppable. And again, I think the first place, the low-hanging fruit for tackling this is to really cleaning up our food supply. And it's not going to be a silver bullet. It's not magic for everybody, but better food for better health, that is a real solution, regardless of whether you're dealing with anything. That's in the best interest of all of our families. And so, just to really start there, to know, you don't have to do everything. You don't have to change the world, but you can do one thing, and you can do one thing at home. You can pick one thing that you want to change in your shopping cart. You can pick maybe one thing that you want to do. If you're an introvert, you can pick one letter that you want to write to a senator. There are so many ways that you can do one thing so that you can help create this change.
Absolutely. And we are so powerful in numbers. You have so much energy. What keeps you going?
It sounds so crazy, but it's just love. It's love for my children, it's love for my friends, and it's love for my country. And I think that we have the capacity to change this, and that love is such a rocket fuel And once we really give each other permission to leverage that, and we really mobilize that, it's unstoppable. And I truly think that there is so much that we can do to restore the health of our country. And it's not going to be something that happens overnight. It's going to be something that happens over a generation. And so I hold on to this image in my mind of being, 85 years old with a silver ponytail, telling this story to our grandchildren. And I just emailed with a friend earlier today. We're going to have some amazing stories to tell as older women, because this really is an opportunity for us to engage and really create remarkable change. And it is very doable. It is very fixable when you look at our food system. We just got to get the artificial junk back out and restore, the food with real ingredients and high quality ingredients. And ingredients that have been around for thousands of years that we know do not cause harm. And that opportunity to me is just so exciting. And so I focus on the positive. I don't like to spend a lot of time focusing on what's happened in the negative. I wrote a book about that, and it's in the book. And there are plenty of people that actually do like kind of finger pointing and focusing on the negative. That's not me. To me, I just look at the landscape in front of us, and I think this is wide open. And how can we build a better system? How can we build something so that our grandchildren will ask, what did you do when you learned that the food system was so messed up? We'll just say, we built a better one.
Well, how do you think this is going to, when you speak about our grandchildren, how do you think this is going to play out in the next 50 years?
I think it's going to be a story like the tobacco industry, quite honestly. I think it's going to be one of those things where we sort of had this awakening, and thankfully our children woke us up. And I do think they are the greatest blessing, because, they came along with all these conditions and it woke us up. And as we woke up, we realized that there was so much that we can do. So I think, in 50 years' time, this will be as clear as it was with the tobacco industry, where, science had been funded to support an industry that was trying to sell a product. And as that was exposed, it became very clear what was good for our health and what wasn't. And I think we'll have that same kind of situation here, where there will be transparency around the science that we don't yet have today, or that we're only just starting to have. And I think, we'll have some amazing success stories. We'll have amazing leaps forward where we'll be able to show that we really did change the system.
I really pray we do. And I think with people like you and all the other people out there that are marching the march with us, you said it many times, we're so powerful in numbers. And I think that those listening, we invite them to also join our team and march right along with us, because the louder we cheer, the more doors that we knock on, the more people that can hear us. It will be inevitable that we're not going away, and we are going to demand change so that way our great-great-grandchildren will have a better world to live in. And you are just so inspirational. I know I've said that already, but you truly are. How do people find out more about you and your work that you're doing?
So please, please, please stay in touch at RobynO'Brien.com, RobynO'Brien.com. The stories that come through that website are so powerful, whether it's from farmers or in the military or, former executives inside the industry, to realize that we really are all together on this issue, that we are so aligned in trying to fix this. So I do really would love to hear from any of the listeners, would love to hear the personal stories, to know where we can, share information and share resources. And then my book, The Unhealthy Truth, although it came out a couple of years ago, unfortunately, it still is very, very relevant, because this is going to take decades to turn the system around. And so there's a lot of great information in there, that kind of talks about the early introduction of a lot of these genetically engineered ingredients, the way that other countries approach these things. It kind of looks at the system. And what I've heard from my readers is that is also a very, very good resource for people that have family members that may or may not be sensitive to this. So people that may say, well, you ate all these things and you were fine. Well, they were different. And, for kind of the naysayer or the people that may roll their eyes, I've heard over and over and over again that book was so valuable because of sort of the financial analysis that I overlay on top of my story. A lot of the moms have said their husbands kind of stole it, and that it really resonated with them. And again, I think the more that we can realize that we really are a team, really pushing this forward, the faster we'll get it done.
Beautiful, wonderful, and just thank you so much for taking the time to help our community, because we are, like you said, we're all together in this. It's not just those with food allergies, but those on the autism spectrum. There's a big crossover, so we can learn so much from you, and just, again, thank you for helping our community the way that you're doing.
Oh, thank you for everything that you're doing, too.
And thank you for all those listening. Remember, make sure to go to Robyn's website at robynobrien.com. Thanks again.